Hi, everyone. Welcome to
Hey,
our virtual author discussion with Thomas Healy, the author of Soul City, with our special guest, Thomas Healy. I'm Alicia, and this is Joe, and we both work at Global Citizen, and we'll serve as your hosts and moderators this afternoon. So before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few details. You are all in the audience, which means no one can hear you unless you are on stage like Joe and I. People can see you, but your picture runs kind of slow, so it's more of like a selfie than it is actual current movement. Um, anyone, the only time that someone's going to hear you is if you're on stage like we are, which that you may have that possibility when we get to the Q&A portion. At the bottom of the bar, you're going to see a lock icon. I would select that button right now if you don't want anyone to sidebar with you during this conversation. That means they can video chat with you directly. We also have a text box function in the chat. You can see that I already sent 2 comments in there. We encourage you to engage with your fellow book club members throughout this experience, but please keep everything mindful and respectful. Soon we're going to bring up the guest of honor, Thomas Healy, in which Joe is going to ask him a few questions, and then we're going to open up to Q&A with questions that you provide. You can submit a question by clicking the question mark icon on the bottom of your screen when we get to that portion, or feel free to submit your questions as we go along. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off to Joe to tell us about our book and bring up Thomas.
thanks so much, Alicia. I'm really excited to be discussing Soul City today. I'm happy that it was our first Global Citizen Book Club selection. It covers a really neglected chapter in U.S. history. It explores urgent and very relevant themes, and it's just a really compelling story. So thank you to everyone in attendance today for joining us and for reading the book. I hope you enjoyed it as well. I'm definitely looking forward to the TV series or HBO movie that gets made since the rights to the book were just sold last week, I believe. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of the book, and then I'm going to give an overview of Thomas's background, and then we'll dive into a moderated discussion before the Q&A, if that sounds good. So Soul City, Race, Equality, and the Lost Dream of an American Utopia is the extraordinary story of how Floyd McKissick, a legend of the civil rights era, sought to build a new modern city in his home state of North Carolina through sheer willpower. From the start, the venture seemed doomed by forces of structural racism. But McKissick struggled for more than a decade to oversee the construction of roads, homes, buildings, water systems, and recreational facilities. His efforts inspired thousands of people across the country and the world, and continue to offer guidance to people who have big dreams but face daunting challenges. And now we'll bring Thomas up to the stage. Hey, Thomas.
Hi, Joe.
So Thomas Healy is the author of, in addition to Soul City, The Great Descent, which won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He is a professor at Seton Hall Law School and has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He's a native of North Carolina, similar to McKissick, and he lives in New York City with his wife and 2 daughters. Thanks for joining us, Thomas. This is a really fantastic read.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's a real thrill to be here. Thank you to you and to Alicia and Global Citizen for organizing this, and to those in the audience who have joined us. Hopefully some of you at least have had a chance to read the book, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it. I love how you describe it as, you know, a book about big dreams that face daunting challenges. I think that's a really good description of it, and I think we face a lot of daunting challenges today. A lot of people have big dreams, so hopefully talking about Floyd McKissick and Soul City can help provide some inspiration for us.
Yeah, I hope so as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to get your feedback to the purchase of the book rights. Like, how did you react to that, and what do you hope comes from that?
I was thrilled, obviously. I mean, that's, you know, every writer wants their book to be made into a movie. And so I'm really excited about it. The Imagine Entertainment has optioned the rights both for documentary and for feature film or a scripted TV series. I'm not sure exactly what they're going to do. They may do everything. They may do a Broadway musical for all I know. But I'm just hopeful that they do something that is thoughtful and respectful I really want this story to be shared as widely as possible. I mean, that was part of the reason for writing the book. I feel like McKissick and Soul City have really been forgotten and in some ways almost erased from our collective memory. And I want this story to be better known, not just because it's something that I'm interested in, but because I think that it's a really important chapter in our history, and I think that there are a lot of important lessons that we can learn from it. So I'm just hopeful that they make something that we can all be proud of, and I'll be working with them to help make sure that that's the case. So, but yeah, I'm just thrilled with that development.
Yeah, there's definitely a cinematic quality to this book, from the beginning of McKissick's life to his conversion to the Republican Party to the ultimate outcome of Soul City. And we're in this period right now in American history of reckoning with a lot of erasure that occurred. There's often like a very whitewashed history that we receive in our school system, and that because of that, major figures like McKissick get erased. So I'm hoping that, as you said, more people come to learn of his history, his role in the civil rights era, and what we can learn from him today. So I'm going to dive into the questions, if that sounds good with you, Thomas.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, cool. So first off, can you talk about the process of writing this book and how you tracked people down and conducted interviews? I know you interviewed dozens of people. You had to do a lot of on-the-ground research yourself. So what were some of the challenges that you encountered along the way?
Well, because Soul City had largely been forgotten, I really had to kind of go back into the archives and go back and talk to the people who were a part of it to create the story. I mean, the general outlines of Soul City and what happened were known, but the general outlines don't really make a book. They don't make a story. I mean, they can make a Wikipedia entry, but you need something more than that. You want to know about the human drama. You want to know about the personalities. You want to know about the details that will really bring the story alive. And in order to do that, I had to rely really on two different types of sources. First, I had to rely on the archival record. Soul City was, when you get right down to it, it was a business undertaking. I mean, it was more than that, but it was at its heart a business undertaking. And they kept records like a business does. I mean, invoices and business letters and contracts and all those sorts of things. And they saved all of that. And it's all archived at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's massive, though. There's about 8,000 folders of documents and drawings and correspondence that I had to wade through. That was a big help. But a lot of those records, as I say, were business records. And they don't exactly give you that kind of color that you need. They help you figure out what's going on from a kind of business standpoint and what's going on from a bureaucratic standpoint. But you really need much more than that to bring a story like this alive. And so to do that, I needed to talk to the people who were a part of Soul City. Floyd McKissick obviously is no longer alive, but fortunately a lot of other people who were involved in Soul City are still alive. Gordon Carey, who was McKissick's right-hand man, Jane Ball Groom, the young mother of 5 children who moved down to Soul City in 1970 from her home in Mount Vernon, New York. Harvey Gantt, the young architect who later went on to be the mayor of Charlotte and lost 2 bitterly contested Senate races to Jesse Helms. Eva Clayton, who went on to serve in Congress, and her husband T.T. Clayton. The McKissick family, Floyd McKissick Jr. and Charmaine McKissick, who were involved in the project and are still alive. So, what I did is I used the archival record to really figure out when things happened and exactly what happened. And then I used interviews with the people who were a part of Soul City to really flesh that out, to get the kind of color and details that you need to create a story. And, one of the urgencies I felt in writing this book now was that a lot of the people who were involved with Soul City are getting older. Gordon Carey is in his mid-80s. Jane Ball Groom is probably in her late 70s. T.T. Clayton actually passed away about a year and a half ago. Fortunately, I was able to talk to him several times beforehand, but I could tell that if someone didn't get in there and start talking to these people and capturing their memories now, that a lot of this would be lost, a lot of this detail. And, if you think about certain scenes in the book, for instance, when T.T. Clayton goes and looks at the property initially, and then he and Floyd McKissick go and they scout out the property and what they see and what T.T. Clayton tells the farmer or the rancher who owns the property, about how this would make a good golf course. He doesn't really tell him, why they're there looking at this property. All of that detail and those pictures, that could only be created because I was able to talk to T.T. Clayton and he was able to relay all that stuff to me. I mean, that stuff is not in newspaper articles. That stuff is not in the archival documents. Nobody was writing that stuff down. And so really I relied on those two sources, and, they complemented each other, because the people I spoke to, they would sometimes tell me things or give me dates that then I would check against the archival record, and I would realize, well, no, that happened a year later, or that happened in this way, not in that way, because obviously this is all a half century old, and people's memories on dates and the order in which things happened are sometimes fuzzy, even though they remember other sorts of details very clearly. And so, it was really a process of putting those two sources together and sort of mapping out the story, what happened when, and trying to figure out, like, what were the key plot points and who were the key figures, and out of all these figures, who really should be highlighted, who played a more crucial role. And it was sort of through that process of reconstructing the story that I was able to see, well, what Jesse Helms did and when he did it, and where Claude Sitton, the editor of the News and Observer, came in, and what his role was. And gradually it became clear to me that, we've got Floyd McKissick as the protagonist, and Jesse Helms as one sort of antagonist, and Claude Sitton as another sort of antagonist. And then when you have those characters, you can start to, develop the story and tell the story around that. So it was a very, long and arduous process. I mean, when you read the book now, it feels like, oh, this is just, it was just sort of easy to relate. But all of that I had to sort of create. And it took me, I think I started working on the book in 2014, came out in 2021. So, about 7 years, which is a big chunk of your life to devote to something like this. But I'm pleased with the result.
Yeah, it sounds like you were really in a race against time too, as you said. There were really important voices that you were able to speak to that really give, as you said, color to the book. And I'm just sitting here so impressed by the amount of documents you must have poured over the past several years. It must have been thousands and thousands of documents, whether it's from the government or McKissick's personal letters. You were very fortunate that McKissick was such a prolific letter writer. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you about. His personal relationships seemed so key to his career. As you said, he leaned on Burton Carey from CORE to run day-to-day operations of Soul City. And he also used friendships with James Meredith, Bob Brown, Irving Fain, Ted Jackson, and numerous others to get past obstacles he faced. So how did McKissick balance his instincts for organizing as an activist, networking as a businessman, and also friendship as somebody who didn't want to seem to come across as exploiting his friends for his own gain?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I learned about Floyd McKissick as I researched this book was how charismatic and charming he was. He had a real ability to make friends, and not only to make friends, but to win friends over, to win them over to support what he was doing. And obviously this was a big part of the civil rights movement. And it's one of the reasons why he became a major figure in the civil rights movement, because you have to inspire, you have to persuade, you have to raise money. That's a big part of what, the job was for being the head of a major civil rights organization. And McKissick really shined in that role. What's so interesting about it to me, though, is that on the one hand, his public persona and his rhetoric was really combative and, sometimes incendiary, and he would say things about about white people that, could be seen as really sort of alienating. And yet, at the same time, he had all of these white friends who adored him and who really supported what he was trying to do. And so I think he had, there was the public persona, Floyd McKissick, who he had to be as the head of CORE, and as someone who wanted to get things done politically. And then there was the personal Floyd McKissick, who was, warm and funny and, endearing, and developed these really strong relationships with, with a lot of, important members of the white establishment, as well as with, many, many Black activists and Black government officials. And you're absolutely right that he ended up relying on these relationships and these friendships in his efforts to build Soul City. He borrowed money from Irving Fane, who was a white real estate developer in Rhode Island, who had been a supporter of various civil rights causes. Irving Fane ended up lending him several $100,000 to help do some of the planning for Soul City. At the same time, McKissick was relying on his friendships with African Americans who were in the Johnson and Nixon administrations, Sam Jackson, Bob Brown, and other people. And he was really fortunate that this was a time when African Americans were starting to be appointed to important positions in government. The first African American cabinet position had just been filled a few years earlier with the head of HUD, but there was now sort of enough of a network of Black officials in government that McKissick could rely on and could utilize to help push his project forward. And I think there was a kind of tricky balancing act between relying on these friends and not feeling as though he was exploiting these friends. And you can see that in his letters back and forth. I mean, that, as you say, that was one of the things that I felt like really helped to give us a window into McKissick and what he was thinking. These, sometimes anguished and often impassioned letters that he's writing to, say, Bob Brown in the White House or Sam Jackson at HUD, pleading with them to help him and expressing his frustration, but then, thanking them, and sort of, reminding them of their friendship. And frankly, I think that those men, I don't think they cared and minded that McKissick was, relying on them. I think they understood that this is how government works. This is how politics works. And it had been working this way for white businessmen for hundreds of years. Why shouldn't it also work this way for Black businessmen or businesswomen?
Yeah, McKissick was masterful, as you said it, changing tones and changing personas depending on the audience that he was working with. One of the most striking parts of the book was the way in which he tried to court Jesse Helms throughout the entire duration of Soul City, and how devastating that must have been to encounter him in the hallway and hear that comment about how Jesse Helms was going to kill Soul City. That must have been so crushing. Yet he was so indefatigable. He just kept going and going. Nothing could crush his spirit. But one thing that seemed to constantly dog him were the bureaucratic catch-22s at HUD in particular. HUD wanted him to have assurances from the industries that he wanted to court before they would greenlight any of the money that he had already been approved to receive, whereas industry said, like, you have to get the money from HUD before we come there. How do you think Soul City would have differed if HUD, instead of being obstructionist, gave him this sort of support and no strings attached support, it seems, that some of the other white developers received who were trying to build similar cities around the country?
You're absolutely right that there were lots of catch-22s. In fact, the whole project of Soul City was a kind of catch-22, or a chicken and egg proposition, right? I mean, here McKissick was trying to build a city in the middle of nowhere, and trying to create an economic base that would attract workers, but you couldn't have that economic base of industry unless there were workers there and an infrastructure and a community to support the industry. And so he was trying to do all these things at once. And that also sort of influenced the way HUD approached the project. McKissick's view was that, look, we just have to build and attract industry and attract workers all at the same time. And if we do it well enough, we can sort of pull it off. And I think HUD was very uncertain about this way of proceeding. But I don't think that HUD, for the most part, I think that HUD was wanted to help McKissick. I didn't sense in the research I didn't sense a lot of racism in HUD, what I sensed was uncertainty about whether this could actually succeed, a lack of understanding about how to help it succeed, because this program that McKissick was relying on, the New Communities program, this was passed by Congress in 1968 and sort of dumped into the lap of HUD. And Congress basically said, look, we want some new communities. Here's some money. HUD, you go figure it out. And the staffers at HUD, they were trying to figure out how to do this at the same time McKissick was. And a lot of the projects that they approved were easier than what McKissick was proposing, because a lot of the projects were satellite communities or bedroom communities, even though the goal of the law was to create entirely new freestanding communities. HUD was the only one of the 13 communities that received federal funding that was going to be an entirely standalone community that needed to create everything from scratch. And so what I see when I read the HUD documents and the correspondence is a real nervousness about whether this can work, and a real uncertainty about how to make it work. And also, I think HUD was never entirely sure that Congress fully supported what it was doing, because Congress approved this money, but it wasn't really that much money. It was the Congress in 1968 that approved it. This was when Johnson was still in office, and then you have a new administration, the Nixon administration. So there's this whole turnover, and then there was sort of growing, I think, skepticism in Washington about the whole New Communities program, as a lot of the projects foundered. And so I think HUD never really gave McKissick 100% support, but I think that's in part because HUD wasn't sure that Congress entirely supported the New Communities program. But I do think that you're absolutely right, that the fact that HUD never fully invested in Soul City was one of the big factors in Soul City's failure to reach its goals, because industry was looking to HUD to figure out whether the federal government was really committed to this. If you're General Motors, you're not going to come in and build a big factory in Soul City unless you believe that the government is committed to helping McKissick follow through on his plans to build this city. And HUD could never really give General Motors the promises that General Motors or other corporations wanted, because I think HUD didn't know how much longer Congress was going to keep providing money to support these cities.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the fact that HUD felt like their hands were tied throughout this whole process. But I think there's a type of due diligence that can mask structural racism. And I think that I know HUD was trying to avoid being blamed for Soul City's failure, but it didn't matter in the end, because the whole program was evaporated. Soul City died, and then HUD was still blamed for Soul City's defeat. So it seems like if they had been enthusiastically supportive, it could have turned out differently. But that kind of brings me to another topic that's parallel to that. Like, as you said, the 68 Congress was different from the Congress in the early 70s, and that really parallels a shift that was taking place in America that you really see embodied in a character like Jesse Helms. Before him, congressmen and senators from North Carolina were at least trying to improve living conditions for the constituents. I think Jesse Helms came on board, and he was kind of like a Fox News prototype. So can you talk about how the prevailing view of government shifted from being seen as a tool to improve people's lives to instead becoming something that needed to be dismantled and demonized, and how maybe that shift was influenced by racism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you, just to go back for a moment to the question of HUD, that, a lot of the red tape and the sort of bureaucratic, wrangling that McKissick had to go through, there was some structural racism involved there, because HUD knew that this project was being watched closely, and knew that there were a lot of critics like Jesse Helms who were ready to pounce. And I think that made HUD more cautious than it otherwise would have been. So I think that's an excellent point. And you're also right about how, this is a moment in history when there's this kind of growing backlash against government programs, a backlash against the war on poverty and against, the sort of social safety net. And what's really interesting is that so many of the programs that the Johnson administration was building on and expanding were initially put in place and implemented in ways that primarily helped white people. I mean, if you read a book like The Color of Law, which does a fantastic job of explaining how the federal government basically created housing segregation in this country, what you'll discover is that the first housing projects were all for white people. In fact, African Americans were excluded from publicly financed housing projects. And, all of the FHA loans that were being given out to people to build homes, and that enabled developers to come in and build all of these middle class homes, those loans were often only available to whites, and the loans wouldn't be given in black neighborhoods through the process of redlining. And so much of the kind of modern day safety net was initially created and benefited whites. And yet what you see happening is, as the government begins to extend that safety net so that it will include people of color, and in particular African Americans, that's when you see this backlash. And that's when you see people like Jesse Helms beginning to demonize the government and to claim that, food stamps are basically the first step towards socialism, and opposing any kind of sort of mass government support for, say, healthcare. And you can really see this shift very clearly in the Republican Party, because you've got on the one hand Jesse Helms, who represents the kind of ascendant libertarian small government racist wing of the Republican Party. And on the other hand, you have the sort of establishment, often quite liberal wing of the Republican Party. People like George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, who was the secretary of HUD when the New Communities program got started, and when McKissick got his federal loan guarantee. People like Nelson Rockefeller, the liberal governor of New York, or John Lindsay, who was the liberal Republican mayor of New York before he switched parties and became a Democrat, and even Richard Nixon, compared to Jesse Helms, looks liberal, and proposed, a pretty substantial federal healthcare plan in the early 1970s. And so, what's happening here is you've got this sort of shift, and I think it's in part because of the way the social safety net is being extended to African Americans, and then you get all of this rhetoric about, welfare queens driving Cadillacs, and all of these myths and tropes about Black people living off the government, and a lot of that is starting here in the 60s, or it's really gaining steam in the 70s, I should say. And Jesse Helms is behind it, and Ronald Reagan is behind it, and Jesse Helms sort of helped pave the way for Ronald Reagan's election in 1980.
And of course, we see the residue, or I guess the effects of what was happening in the 70s still today. There's a great book, just a side note, called Strangers in Their Own Land by Arleigh Hawkschild, a sociologist, that describes early Tea Party supporters, and they're remarkably similar to what was happening in the 70s, as you describe in the book. I'm going to shift real quick to one of the other antagonists, as you said in the book, the News and Observer, the primary local paper that was covering Soul City. At a certain point, they became one of the leading antagonists of Soul City. They published a lot of investigative reports that was saying basically it was a huge waste of money and that McKissick was just lining his pockets. And Claude Sitton was publishing editorials that were describing the same thing, and that really contributed to the downfall of Soul City, at least it seemed to me. So I know that you were a former reporter, and you used to work there, you used to work in the same office as the investigative journalist who was so committed to exposing the corruption of Soul City. So what did you learn about the power of media, its ability to shape public perception, and the ways in which reporting can get derailed by personal bias?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I obviously thought a lot about it as I was working on this book, because I used to be a newspaper reporter at this very newspaper, and I worked in the same newsroom with Pat Stith, the reporter who wrote most of these stories that wrongly accused Soul City of all sorts of corruption and fraud and mismanagement. And you know, I'm no longer a newspaper reporter, but you know, I'm a big supporter of newspapers and investigative journalism. And so I had to think a lot about, you know, what this story revealed about the limits and the pitfalls of investigative reporting. And I think, you know, one of the biggest things it shows is just how the imperative of the story takes over, right? At a certain point, you know, you've invested so much into the story, into uncovering something, that you have to justify that expenditure of resources and time. And you justify it by writing this big splashy investigative series. And then you have to keep it going. I mean, this is how it works. And I know this is how it works because I've been there and I've been a part of this. You know, there's a playbook for how it's not written down, but it's every journalist, every newspaper reporter knows how the playbook works. You uncover something, you report it, then the next day you write a story, getting people on the record responding to it, and then you start seeking people who want an investigation, and then you write a story that people are calling for an investigation or an audit or, you know, prosecution or whatever. And then you go to those government officials and you ask them what they're going to do about it. And then you hound them until they say they're going to launch the investigation. And then you follow the investigation and, you know, and it just keeps going. And that's exactly what happened here. And, you know, the News and Observer, even after this congressional audit, largely clears the News and Observer. And I say largely because they did find some bookkeeping irregularities that were largely a result of inexperience and being understaffed. But on the big things that the News and Observer was accusing Soul City of, the congressional audit basically says there's nothing to see here. There's no reason to even initiate prosecution. The News and Observer can't accept that. And so when it reports on the results of the congressional audit, what does it do? It focuses on these small things that the audit found. A lot of these were, you know, improperly filled out travel vouchers. You know, I mean, come on. I was a newspaper reporter. Like, newspaper reporters are famous for, that's where they do their fiction writing, is in their travel vouchers. And the News and Observer makes a huge deal about this. And then the News and Observer, sort of the editorial page, sits back and blames Floyd McKissick for all of this. Well, if he had been running, you know, a more sort of, you know, shape operation, there wouldn't have been this kind of scrutiny that allowed people like Jesse Helms to come in and to pile on the project, ignoring the fact that it was the News and Observer itself that published all of these stories, lacking context and exaggerating claims and using all sorts of innuendo and suggestions that Floyd McKissick is going to jail and citing, you know, criminal codes in the article. It's just absurd. And, you know, and they never acknowledged that they were wrong. and that they unfairly targeted McKissick. And what I find so troubling about it is that, Claude Sitton, who's the editor of the News and Observer, was this great, legendary civil rights reporter for the New York Times, who provided incredibly sympathetic and honest coverage of the civil rights movement, and was viewed as a hero by civil rights activists for his reporting. And he should have been a natural ally for Floyd McKissick, as Claude Sitton was the head of the editorial page at the NNO. This was a project that was going to bring money to a desperately poor part of the state. How could the editors of the News and Observer oppose this unless they don't care about the poor people in the state? And white, not only black, but poor whites in that part of the state would have benefited from Soul City. But Claude Sitton just, he was very stubborn. He saw things in very strict black and white terms. And all he could think was that this was going to be a separatist project, even though McKissick made clear it wouldn't, and even though a quarter of his staff was white. And Claude Sitton just got it in his head that this was a bad thing, and the News and Observer was going to do what it could to see that it didn't succeed. And to me, that is one of the saddest parts of the story, and also one of the parts of the story that we can learn from the most, because I don't know what you do about people like Jesse Helms. I don't know. I mean, I think hopefully over time there are fewer people like Jesse Helms. But I think it's pretty hard to argue someone like Jesse Helms out of those views. And he was probably going to oppose Soul City regardless. But I think that there are people like Claude Sitton now who want to do the right thing, who want to be allies of people of color, who believe in racial justice. And the question is, well, so how do you go about actually helping? And I think one of the lessons here is, well, you listen to what African Americans and other people of color are telling you that they need and what they think will help them. And Floyd McKissick was saying to Claude Sitton, look, for black people to be equal, we need to have our own wealth. We need to have a place where we can run the show and have self-determination. And Claude Sitton couldn't accept that because, in his mind, integration only came in one form, and that was where most of the people in a community were white, and then black people assimilated into it. And so I think that's, to me, it was important to show not only Jesse Helms's role, but to show the role of someone like Claude Sitton.
Yeah, I think you really said that well. It had a lot to do with a profound lack of context and perspective on the part of the NNO. And what's really tragic is today the media landscape has been so hollowed out. Local reporting is been decimated. So there's even less context sometimes today. There's even less perspective because you don't have these reporters who oftentimes are doing great investigative journalism, who are on the ground asking the questions, doing the research to then fill in the public. So my next question is about some of those parallels that we see between the time of Soul City and today. I know that you told me before that you were thinking a lot about what happened in Ferguson at the time of when you began working on this book. So can you talk a bit about some of those parallels between that era and today, from the widespread police brutality to how difficult it is to change public opinion? And can you talk about how these perceived parallels were influencing the book as you were working on it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was struck over and over as I was working on this by the parallels between now and then, and also in particular between what was happening in Ferguson and other cities and what was happening on the ground in the part of North Carolina where McKissick was trying to build Soul City. I mean, I would read things that McKissick wrote, and he would say things almost literally word for word like Black Lives Matter, and you're just sitting there and you're thinking, wow, we've been at this for a long time, and haven't moved forward enough, and certainly the issue of police violence and white control over police departments is a huge part of McKissick's life. I mean, the backstory that I provide for McKissick, really shows that. I mean, his two sort of formative encounters with racism as a young person are with this white trolley conductor, who orders him to the back of the trolley car using all sorts of racial epithets, and these white police officers, who verbally and physically assault him when he's part of this Boy Scout skating competition in Asheville. And McKissick said in one of his conversations with the people who were building Columbia, Maryland, they were talking about, why do you want to build a city that's predominantly black? And he even said at one point, there should be a place where black people know that the police force is controlled by black people. And then when they walk down the street, the police officers who are there are black and not white. And so there's so many parallels and the sort of lack of self-determination and autonomy. And that's really what struck me when I thought about Ferguson on the one hand and Soul City on the other. So I got the idea for this book right before the protests in Ferguson, or I should say, I remembered the story. I started doing some research and I was thinking about it. And when I first started thinking about it, so this is probably like the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014, and I'm not sure whether you remember, but this was a time when a lot of people were talking about a post-racial America because Barack Obama had been elected president. And I remember sitting there and wondering, are people going to be interested in a story about Soul City now that we're living in a post-racial America? I don't mean to laugh. It's just, it's almost comical that we could have thought that at this time. And then Ferguson happened. And, I thought about what was going on in Ferguson. Here you had a community that was 2/3 African-American, and yet everything was controlled by whites, right? The city council and the school board and the police department, which had only a few black officers. And I think that the protests in Ferguson they were triggered by the killing of Michael Brown, but they were really about more than that. They were about this lack of autonomy and self-determination and control. And that's exactly what McKissick was trying to address in 1969. Warren County, the part of North Carolina where he wanted to build Soul City, was 2/3 African American, and yet everything was controlled by whites. The city council, the county commissioners, the board of education, the planning department, everything. There was only one black police officer on the local police department, and you had Klan signs, on the highway. And McKissick, his view was that there could not be equality until black people had some control and self-determination. And he thought that you needed to have that on a large scale, the scale of a city. And so that lack of control that he was trying to fix was the exact same thing that the residents of Ferguson were upset about and protesting, at that time, 45 years later. And so, it just seemed to me that what McKissick was trying to achieve, we still hadn't achieved. And I hope that by going back and recounting what happened to Soul City, that it might shed some light on the forces that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, as you said, there's been a lot of historical gaslighting. To even suggest that it's a post-racial society is absurd, as you said. It's almost been like 400 years of living in a dystopian society for black people in America. Ferguson is one of the most dystopian places that I've read about. What went on there prior to the killing of Michael Brown and what still goes on there. And here you had Soul City, which was this just extraordinary effort of hope and love and unity that was trying to really transform America, like show how America could be transformed by giving people opportunity and hope. But then today there's a prison on the site of Soul City, and they use prison labor to produce cleaning supplies. Like, that's as dystopian of an outcome as I can imagine. And Soul City was ultimately defeated, at least the vision that McKissick had, but at the same time, it changed a lot of people's lives. It transformed a lot of people's lives. A lot of the people who were involved in it went on to do amazing things in their careers. So if it had happened in another political climate, it might have succeeded and might have been different. So I'm wondering how you want Soul City to be remembered after having spent so many years thinking about it and writing about it.
Well, I mean, first, I want it to be remembered. You know, I don't want it to be forgotten. I want the record to be set straight. You know, too many people still think that McKissick, you know, went to jail or was violating laws. I mean, and I mean people who should know better. I've seen posts on Facebook and Twitter from former editors at the News and Observer who say things that, you know, McKissick was a crook. And I respond, I said, where do you get this? Like, you're making this up. You're supposed to be a respected journalist, and you're just blatantly lying because you are influenced by something that was written in this newspaper 40 years ago. So, you know, making sure that it's remembered and making sure that it's remembered accurately, I think is important. And also, you know, respecting what McKissick's vision was, and respecting, you know, this dream. I mean, sure, Soul City itself didn't pan out the way McKissick hoped, but what he really wanted was to create a place in America, to create an America where Black people would feel at home. You know, he said when he was a boy, and he had those encounters with the trolley conductor and the police officer, that he felt like a Black boy in a white land. And I think that most of what he did, his life, was about trying to sort of change what he called the sort of hierarchy of identities. You know, he thought he was Black first and American second, and I think he wanted to be American first and to feel, you know, like this was his country as much as it was the country of white people. And so, you know, I think it's that dream, rather than like specifically Soul City, that we should think about, and we should keep trying to work toward an America where everybody, regardless of the color of their skin, or regardless of, you know, when they got here or how long they've been or where they came from, everybody feels like America is a place where they have opportunity, and where they can strive to achieve their dreams. I think that's really what Soul City was about, and it's important to keep those dreams in mind. You know, utopian ventures, and this was utopian in some senses, just because nothing like this had ever been attempted, although it was very practical in other ways. But, you know, utopian dreams are important because they remind us of the gap between what is and what should be. And I think this story helps to do that. It helps to you know, he paints a picture of the kind of place that could exist where Black people would have just as much of a shot at the American dream as everybody else. And it's important that we keep striving toward that picture that he painted, because we're certainly not there yet.
Yeah, I hope that we can all just summon the courage and endurance of Floyd McKissick in the years ahead, because there's a lot of the same struggles that we're facing today as he was facing. This has been a really extraordinary conversation, Thomas. I really appreciate your responses to my questions, and I'm really grateful that you wrote this book and are helping to shine light on McKissick and Soul City. I think now we're going to open it up to questions.
Yes. So hi, everyone. Now it's time for our Q&A portion. We're going to try and get to a couple questions before we end our event today. So as a reminder, to submit your question, you're going to select the question mark icon on the bottom of your screen and type it in there so I can bring you on the stage. So you're going to ask Thomas yourself. Know when you're on the stage, everyone can see and hear you just like we are now. If you do not feel comfortable coming up, please submit it in the text chat, and I can read the question for you. But with that being said, I think I'm going to bring up our first person, Amy.
Hi
Hi,
there.
Amy. Can you tell us where you're from and your name as well?
Yeah, I live in New York. I'm Amy. I wanted to, you already got that, I guess. Sorry, I feel awkward. Um, Thank you for doing this. I have to say, this is a crazy story, and I guess in some ways I'm really surprised we've never heard about it, and then in others, not at all surprised. But my question is a little bit more of a personal one for you, Thomas. I just wonder, having gone through the process of learning about all the detail here and sitting here in like our current reality, how did this shape your perspective or change your perspective on how we might best be able to create more racial economic equality today? Because I don't think we've really, we clearly haven't gotten there. So I just wonder what lessons you learned and how you would apply them to now.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. That's a great question. Um, you know, one of the things that I feel like I learned, I hope I learned something in working on this book, um, is, to when there are sort of questions being debated about racial justice and racial equality, um, I think it's very tempting for people and maybe in particular for white people to think that they know the answer, and to sort of want to jump in and say, okay, well, I can sort this out. I know what we should do here, and I think that and to have sometimes knee-jerk responses to certain kinds of proposals, um, whether it's defund the police or something else. And I think one of the lessons that I learned personally is the importance of 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 sort of knowing, like, of being humble about what I know and what I don't know, and realizing that I don't live as a person of color. Like, that's not my experience, and there's a lot that I don't know and don't understand about what people of color and in particular African Americans in this country face. And I think it's just so important that white people, um, that they keep that in mind, and that they take seriously what Black people say. I mean, it's very tempting, when you hear stories about say microaggressions or implicit bias to sweep away some of these things and say, oh, it can't really be that bad, or oh, did that really happen? Maybe they didn't mean it that way. And I found myself doing things like this in the past, and I hope that, like, I've gotten better about realizing that people aren't making things up. I mean, why would people make things up, and why would people be, you know, proposing things unless they thought that they would help? And that doesn't mean that, just because people say defund the police, that we should all agree defund the police. But I do think it means taking seriously what people of color are saying about their experience. And I find myself, doing this a lot more than I used to. So, for instance, in word choices, like how we talk about things, I'm a writer and I care a lot about language. And I can often be kind of like, averse to kind of changes to language. Um, uh, Thinking sometimes, well, is that really necessary? Is that really accomplishing anything? And now I think I'm much more open to those conversations. And I'm also a free speech scholar. And so, I in the past, I think I've always been like, kind of free speech, hurrah. And now I think I'm much more sensitive to, to the harm that speech can cause, and to the importance of listening to what other people are saying and listening to what people of color are saying. All of that is, I think, very general and theoretical. It's not specific, concrete. Like, how do we actually put more money in the hands of people of color and of African Americans? I'm not a policy wonk. I mean, I'm not an economist. I'm not. But obviously, like, investing government money in Black institutions and Black communities and Black schools. I think supporting, HBCUs is a terrific idea, and making sure that HBCUs continue to thrive. I think that encouraging in whatever way we can the development of private private enterprises that are owned by African Americans, and encouraging more private investment in Black businesses. I mean, those are all things that I think would help, and and breaking down housing segregation, and I mean, there's just a long list of policy things you could do, and access to the ballot is incredibly important in order to make sure that people's interests are represented. So, I could make up a whole laundry list of policy prescriptions, but I think just kind of, above and beyond that is just, the importance for people like me who are sympathetic to the cause of racial justice to listen more and to take our cues more from the people who live and experience racial injustice all the time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
It was such an interesting story.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, can you tell us your name, where you're from, and what your question is?
So I'm from India. My name is Priyal Tale, and I'm a final year humanities student. And I also study history in college. So I found your book very interesting. So my question to you was, so as a history student, what I feel is that in the Indian context, the tribal history and the Indian history, the women's participation in the freedom struggle of Indian history is missing in the academic textbooks. So I would like to work on that. So I wanted to ask you as an author, from where can I start?
From where can you start? I mean, I think, I sympathize with what you're saying about how stories get lost and people's role in our history gets lost. And you're doing the first thing correct, which is you're studying history, and I think you got to tell those stories. I think that there is maybe now more than ever an appetite and a hunger to hear these stories that have been forgotten. I think there's a lot more pressure on, say, the publishing industry, whether it's commercial publishing or academic publishing, to help these stories be told. And so I would encourage you to find these stories and to try to tell them, and to try to spread the word about them. I mean, you can tell stories in all sorts of ways. You can tell them through books, you can tell them through film, you can tell them through academic articles. You can tweet about them. So I think that's really what we all have to do, is we all have to connect with one another, and then tell these stories and retell them, so that people understand them and take them seriously. I mean, I know as an author myself, I'm much more kind of conscious of that now than I was. My first book was, about a white judge, in early 20th century America. It was not a forgotten story necessarily. It was not about forgotten people. And now writing this book, it makes me much more conscious of the need to tell these neglected and undertold stories. And thinking about my next book, I have that in mind as well. So I don't know if I can offer you anything more concrete than that, but just tell the stories, do the research and tell the stories. And I think that there's an appetite to hear them now.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we hit our time for this event. Thank you for everyone for attending. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions in the Q&A. But again, thank you, Thomas, for joining us and for writing this wonderful book. I hope more people read it, and I'm sure that once it hits HBO, it's going to gain an even larger audience. Is there anything that you want to say before we close out today?
No, just thank you, Joe and Alicia and everyone who was here, and Amy and Priya for asking your questions. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your interest in the book and your interest in the story, and hopefully, we can all continue to share this story. Not for me, but for the people who were a part of this. I mean, those are the people who, who I really want to be recognized. The Jane Ball Grooms and the Gordon Careys and the T.T. Claytons and the Eva Claytons and the Floyd McKissicks and his entire family. I want them to feel as though their effort and their work and their dreams were not for nothing, and that people remember those and respect them. So I think if we can all do what we can to share their story, that would be terrific. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for joining us today. All right, everyone, please give it up for Thomas. Thank you, everyone, for reading the book with us this last month. I want to encourage you to also join us this month for reading Somewhere in the Unknown World by Kylo Yang. It is actually a collective refugee memoir written by a refugee herself about different refugees that end up in Twin Cities, Minnesota, a state that has welcomed more refugees per capita than any other. Just like you did before, grab a copy of the book and join our discussion on our Global Citizen Facebook group, Global Citizen All Access, and enter to attend the virtual discussion with the author herself in July. I believe you should see a pop-up on your screen now. We look forward to seeing you next week, and thank you for joining us today. So how you leave is you simply close out this webpage. Take care, everyone.